In 1885, one American family stood at the summit of the Gilded Age. By many accounts of the time, no larger private fortune existed anywhere on Earth. Less than a century later, that same name had become something else entirely, a story people told about loss. By the end of this, you will know the single difference that decided it. One choice. Not luck, not talent, not the size of the money. Because here's the part that should stop you. The family that reached that peak, the one that was, at its height, the richest of them all, is the family that vanished. The quieter name, the one that built its fortune a little later, is still standing today. Same country, same century, same tax laws, the same wars, the same crashes. Opposite endings. There was no invasion, no stolen empire, no single catastrophe that explains it. Two families simply made different choices about one thing, and that one difference decided which name would last 150 years and which would be spent in 50. And you will see why the people who build wealth that truly lasts are almost never the ones you would expect. Let me show you what they won't. To understand how a fortune dies, you first have to see how large it was when it was alive. In January of 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt died as the richest man in America. By one estimate, he left behind around $105 million. Some sources place it nearer $100 million. Either way, it was one of the largest fortunes the young country had ever seen. He had built it out of steamships and railroads, out of iron nerve and a refusal to lose. Now, how do you even make sense of a number like that across 150 years? Here is where the honest storytellers and the lazy ones part ways. If you simply adjust that fortune for inflation, it comes out to something around $3 billion today. But if you measure it the way economists actually prefer, as a share of the entire American economy of its era, the same fortune balloons to something closer to $140 billion. Those two numbers describe the same man. They are not interchangeable, and anyone who hands you a single tidy figure is guessing. What matters is not the exact dollar amount. What matters is that by any method, this was one of the largest concentrations of private wealth the world had ever produced. And when the Commodore wrote his will, he made a decision that tells you everything about how this family thought. He gave almost all of it to one person. Of the entire fortune went to a single son, William Henry. The other children, 8 daughters and a second son, received comparatively small sums. To his grandsons through William Henry, he left specific bequests, $5 million to one, $2 million apiece to the others. His 8 daughters received somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 each. His second son was left only the income from a modest trust. Set against a fortune of $100 million, these were rounding errors. The Commodore was not dividing his empire among his children. He was appointing a single successor and handing everyone else a consolation prize. It was not cruelty. In the Commodore's mind, it was strategy. He believed a fortune divided was a fortune destroyed, so he refused to divide it. And for one generation, he looked like a genius. William Henry took that inheritance and, in under 9 years, nearly doubled it, climbing to around $200 million by the time he died in 1885. That was the peak. By many popular histories, no individual on the planet held more wealth than a Vanderbilt in that moment. Now hold that image, and let me introduce the other family. At the very same time, a quiet, austere man named John D. Rockefeller was assembling something different. Not a railroad empire, but an oil empire. Standard Oil. His fortune came later than the Commodore's, and it grew differently. By 1913, it was estimated near $900 million. In 1916, he became the first billionaire the world had ever seen. And when he died in 1937, he was worth an estimated $1.4 billion. So here is the trap most people fall into. They assume the family that survived must simply have been richer all along. It is not that simple. By the method historians use to compare fortunes across centuries, each one measured as a share of the national economy of its day, Rockefeller is usually ranked as the single largest personal fortune in American history. The Vanderbilts sit just behind him. But at the exact instant each family touched its own peak, the picture flips. In 1885, the Vanderbilt fortune was, in that moment, larger than anything Rockefeller had yet built. The oil empire that would eventually surpass it was still being assembled. So sit with the paradox, because the whole story lives inside it. The family that stood on top of the world first is the one that vanished. The family that built more slowly is the one still standing. The difference was never the size of the fortune. It was the machine built to hold it. Every great fortune eventually meets the same enemy. Not a rival, not a recession, the next generation. It is handed down, and it is in the handing down that most of it is lost. So the first question you should ask about any fortune that lasts is deceptively simple. What holds it together once the person who made it is gone? And this is where our two families turn in completely opposite directions. Look at the Vanderbilts. His answer to that question was a single human being, his son, William Henry. That was the structure, not a system, not an institution, a man. And even that choice did not hold cleanly. 3 of the Commodore's own heirs contested the will in open court, arguing that their father had not been of sound mind when he signed it. To make the challenge disappear, William Henry settled, paying each of them cash and setting up a trust on top of it, buying peace from the very relatives who had just sued him. The settlement itself is worth pausing on. To each of the 3 who had challenged him, William Henry paid $200,000 in cash and stood up a trust of $400,000 more on top of that. Think about what that reveals. The very first thing that happened to this fortune, in the moment its creator was gone, was that a piece of it had to be carved off and paid out simply to stop the family from tearing at itself in public. That is not a structure absorbing a shock. That is the absence of a structure, improvising under fire. The fortune had barely changed hands, and it was already being litigated in public. Here is the part that matters most. Across every generation that followed, the Vanderbilt wealth moved the same way, divided directly, portion by portion, heir by heir, with no shared vehicle holding it together. Search the historical record and you will not find a unified family office. You will not find a common trust structure binding the descendants into one enterprise. Each inheritance simply cut the fortune into smaller pieces, and those pieces into smaller pieces still, until eventually there was very little left to cut. A pie, sliced and sliced again, until the slices meant nothing. Now look at what Rockefeller built instead. In 1882, while the Vanderbilts were still at their absolute peak, John D. Rockefeller quietly established a family office at 26 Broadway, inside the Standard Oil Building. Its purpose was not to spend the fortune. Its purpose was to manage it, professionally, the way you would run a corporation. The investments, the accounts, the entire wealth of the family organized and overseen as a single portfolio. This was not a man with a checkbook. It was an institution with a staff. Grilled decades later, in the autumn of 1933, that office moved into the newly built RCA building at Rockefeller Center, taking floors 54 through 56. It became known, informally, by the number of its suite, room 5600. Picture that for a moment. Not a mansion, not a monument, but a working office, high above the city, where an entire dynasty's money was watched over as a professional enterprise, year after year, long after the founder himself was gone. And around that office, they wrapped legal armor. In 1934, John D. Rockefeller Jr. created a set of 6 trusts, one for each of his children, holding Standard Oil stock and real estate. Then, in 1952, another layer was added, a series of generation-skipping trusts built for the grandchildren, deliberately locked so that the core capital could not simply be cashed out and spent by any single heir in a single lifetime. and these were administered not by a family member with a taste for palaces, but by a bank. Do you see the difference already? One family's fortune was a pile of money handed to a person. The other's was an institution designed to outlive every person inside it. But a structure is only ever as strong as the people you hand it to. And that is the second difference, the one the Vanderbilts never even attempted. You can build the most sophisticated trust in the world, and it will still fail if the next generation does not know how to hold it. The rich understand something most families never quite admit. An heir is not born, an heir is made. Vanderbilts, for all their wealth, never built that machinery. When the Commodore concentrated almost everything in one son, he did more than pick a favorite. He skipped the work of preparing everyone else. There was no institution teaching the wider family how to be stewards instead of spenders. There was no structure readying future generations for the weight that was moving toward them. The fortune was passed forward, but the discipline that had created it was not. And discipline that is not deliberately taught tends to die with the person who had it. The Commodore's grandchildren inherited his money. They did not inherit his refusal to lose. The Rengineer, not something you cross your fingers and hope for. In 1967, the family created the Rockefeller Family Fund, and its purpose is the detail almost no one knows. It was built, in part, to train the next generation, the younger cousins, in how to actually run a trust and manage the family's philanthropy. Read that again, slowly. They built a school for stewardship decades before any crisis demanded one. The governance was institutionalized before it was needed, not improvised in a panic after something had already broken. See that same discipline shrunk down to the size of a child's allowance. John D. Rockefeller Jr., a man moving hundreds of millions of dollars through trusts, required each of his children to keep a personal ledger. The weekly allowance was 25 cents. 10% of it went to charity, 10% went to savings. The rest had to be accounted for, line by line, in the notebook. If a child wanted more, he earned it, pulling weeds, chopping wood, even killing flies for a set rate. One of those children, Nelson Rockefeller, raised vegetables and rabbits to make extra money on the side. Now think about what that actually is. It is the exact same principle that governed the entire family fortune: accountability, structure, money that must be justified rather than merely enjoyed, reproduced in miniature, at the breakfast table, on a boy who would never in his life need those 25 cents. They were not teaching him to budget. They were teaching him to be trusted with something enormous, long before it would ever reach his hands. And understand why that matters as much as it does. A fortune rarely dies because a market turns or a business fails. It dies because it lands in the hands of someone who was handed the money but never handed the mindset. Someone who sees the wealth as a fact about themselves rather than a responsibility they were prepared to carry. The Rockefellers refused to let that happen by accident. They treated the raising of an heir with the same seriousness as the managing of the fortune, because they understood that underneath, the two were the same task wearing different clothes. And it held up at full scale. After several members of the older generation had died, the fourth generation stepped into the majority of seats on the family's main philanthropic board for the very first time. And to make even that transition smooth, the family created rotating seats, so the youngest cousins could ease into responsibility gradually rather than being thrown into it all at once. The handover was calm because it had been rehearsed for years. There was no fight over the chairs, because every chair already had a trained hand waiting beside it. So now you have two of the pillars: a structure to hold the money, a system to prepare the people. But there is a third difference between these families, and it is the one you can still see with your own eyes today, carved in marble, up and down Fifth Avenue. There is a kind of spending that looks like wealth, and is, in truth, its opposite. The old money world understands the trap, even when they never say it aloud. An asset that only consumes and never produces. The most spectacular illustration of that trap in American history. Along a single stretch of Fifth Avenue in New York, the family raised a row of palaces so grand that the street itself came to be called Vanderbilt Row. There was the Triple Palace, built in 1882. There was William K. Vanderbilt's French chateau. There was Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion, among the largest private homes the city had ever seen. Imported marble, carved stone, ballrooms built to hold hundreds of guests. They were monuments to having arrived, proof, in limestone, that the family had reached the very top of the world. And here is what became of them. At least 10 of those great Fifth Avenue mansions were torn down, most of them between the 1920s and the middle of the century. The Triple Palace, built in 1882, was demolished by 1944. William Kay's chateau came down in 1926. On its site today stands an ordinary commercial tower. Cornelius II's mansion was demolished in 1926, and in its place rose a department store that still occupies the corner. The palaces did not merely lose value, they became burdens. Too expensive to maintain, too enormous to sell, eventually worth more as cleared lots than as homes. The status that had cost a fortune to build cost yet another fortune simply to keep, and then it was gone, swept away as if it had never stood there at all. There is a quiet lesson buried in those cleared lots. A mansion is not an asset in the way people imagine. It does not earn, it demands. Taxes, staff, repairs, heat, upkeep that never ends and only swells with the years. A great house is a bill that arrives every single month for as long as you own it, and its grandeur is precisely what makes the bill so ruinous. The Vanderbilts had built their proof of success in the one form that could not sustain itself and could not be quietly sold when the tide turned. They had poured their fortune into stone, and stone, it turns out, is very heavy to carry. Now watch what the other family did with its money at the very same moment in history. Instead of building monuments to itself, the Rockefeller family built an institution pointed outward, at the world. In 1913, they chartered the Rockefeller Foundation with an initial gift of $35 million, followed by tens of millions more pledged in perpetuity, dedicated, in their own words, to promoting the well-being of humanity. More than a century later, that foundation is still operating, still carrying the family name, its mission almost unchanged from the day it was written. Consider the difference in what each family actually purchased. One bought marble that eventually had to be demolished. The other bought a purpose and a reputation that has compounded quietly for over 100 years. And now let me give you the single detail that captures this entire contrast in one image. In the early 20th century, John D. Rockefeller Sr. lived on Fifth Avenue as well, and beside his own home stood mansions belonging to two Vanderbilt sisters. Rockefeller bought them both, and then he had them torn down, replacing them with modern buildings. The family that lasts, literally buying and demolishing the homes of the family that faded, building over them, brick by brick, on the same street where both had once tried to prove the very same thing. It is not a metaphor that some writer invented afterward. It actually happened. The monuments to consumption were cleared away to make room for something more useful, by the very hands that understood the difference between the two. Which brings us to the next test. Because when a fortune is finally challenged from within, and in every great family, eventually, it is, the heirs either stand together or they turn on one another in public. A fortune is tested most not in the making, but in the inheriting. That is the moment a family reveals what it truly is, a council or a set of opponents who happen to share a surname. And these two families gave the world a near perfect demonstration of each. Begin with how the Rockefellers hold themselves together. This is a family that meets, deliberately, on a schedule, generation after generation. They gather at least twice a year, a family forum in the summer at the historic family property up the Hudson Valley, and again around the holidays in New York. They maintain a family council of rotating membership, a standing body where the actual business of being a family is conducted. There is no single dramatic document that fuses them into one. There is something far more durable than any document, the plain, unglamorous habit of sitting in the same room on purpose again and again, and settling things together before they have a chance to curdle into disputes. Unity, for them, is not a feeling that comes and goes. It is a scheduled event. Now look at how the Vanderbilts met the same pressure. We have already seen the first crack, 3 heirs dragging the Commodore's will into court within months of his death, publicly declaring their own father insane. But the most famous rupture came decades later, and it is remembered to this day as the trial of the century. Stop the Fate of a Vanderbilt Child became a national spectacle. 10-year-old Gloria Vanderbilt, and, far more to the point, control of the trust attached to her, sat at the center of a custody battle between her own mother, Gloria Morgan Vanderbilt, and her paternal aunt, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. For 7 weeks, the private life of the family was pried wide open in a courtroom, the testimony lurid enough to fill newspapers from one coast to the other. In the end, the court took custody of the girl away from her mother and handed it to the aunt. Stop and see what that truly was. Among the Vanderbilts, the control of a single trust, the future of one child's inheritance, could not be resolved inside the family. It had to be dragged in front of a judge, in public, for the entire nation to watch and gossip about. The very kind of matter the Rockefellers settled quietly, in a room on the Hudson, the Vanderbilts settled in front of reporters and photographers. And consider the cost of that, well beyond the money. Every one of those public battles did two things at once. It drained the fortune through lawyers and settlements, and it drained something far harder to replace, the family's own sense of itself as a single thing worth protecting. Each lawsuit quietly taught the next generation that the way you got what was yours was to fight your own relatives for it. In that same era, the Rockefellers were teaching the exact opposite lesson in their quiet room on the Hudson, that what was yours was safe precisely because you never had to fight for it. Two families, training their children in two completely opposite reflexes about blood and money. This is the pattern running beneath both stories, and it is worth naming plainly. One family treated its heirs as members of a shared institution, with a place to resolve tension before it could ever detonate. The other left its heirs as separate individuals, each clutching a piece of a shrinking pie, with no forum to turn to but the court. And individuals clutching pieces will, sooner or later, fight over them. It is not a flaw in any particular Vanderbilt's character. It is simply what happens to any family that never builds a structure to hold its people together. The money pulls them apart, because nothing was ever built to keep them whole. By now you can feel where all of this is heading, but nothing reveals the final score of these two strategies more brutally than what became of the objects themselves, the houses, the estates, the offices, because most of them you can still go and see today. And what you find when you get there tells you, without a single word, which strategy won. If you want to know how a strategy truly ends, do not read the biography. Go look at what became of the buildings. Consider the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, the grandest of all the Vanderbilt houses, built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II in the 1890s. Its construction alone cost more than $7 million. Add the furnishings and the grounds, and the figure climbs closer to 12. In today's terms, that is a palace worth well over $150 million. And here is how the story of that house ends. By 1948, the family could no longer justify the cost of keeping it, and leased the mansion to a local preservation society for $1 a year. Then, in 1972, a granddaughter of the very man who built it, the Countess Sylvia Zeperi, sold the Breakers outright, the house along with roughly 90% of its original furnishings, for $365,000. Let that number land. A house that cost more than $7 million to build, sold, decades later, for $365,000, roughly 1/20th of its original construction cost. And that is before you even account for nearly 80 years of inflation eating away at the dollar in between. The single greatest monument the family ever raised left their hands for a fraction of what one wing of it had cost to build. And here is what makes that sale sting in a way the number alone cannot capture. The Breakers was not sold because the family met with some ordinary run of bad luck. It was sold because the thing itself had become impossible to hold. A masterpiece that cost more to keep standing than the family could justify, year after year, generation after generation, until finally letting it go was the only mercy left. The grandeur never protected the fortune. The grandeur is exactly what consumed it. And it was the same story inland, at Biltmore, the largest private house ever built in America, raised by George Washington Vanderbilt in the mountains of North Carolina. After his death, the estate became too vast and too costly to carry. Around 1920, the family sold roughly 86,000 acres of it to the United States government at $5 an acre, land that became the core of a national forest. Of the estate's original 125,000 acres, only about 8,000 remain in the family's hands today. An empire of land transferred to the public, acre by acre, at a price that barely registers as a transaction. And there is a story, told most famously in a memoir written by a Vanderbilt descendant himself, that when the family gathered for a reunion in 1973, not a single Vanderbilt in the room was a millionaire. I want to be honest with you about that one. The line comes from a family memoir, not from any independent financial audit, and the most careful histories do not repeat it as fact. So take it for exactly what it is, the family's own legend about itself. But notice this, even the legend they tell about themselves is a legend of loss. Now set all of that beside the other family's monument. The Rockefellers did not build their most important structure out of marble. They built it out of an institution, that family office founded back in 1882. And that office never became a museum. It never became a national forest. It simply evolved. Its direct institutional descendant operates today as a modern wealth management firm bearing the family's name, established as an independent company in 2018, overseeing roughly $19 billion in assets, employing thousands of people, with the family still holding a stake in it. A living line, unbroken, running from 1882 straight into the present, nearly a century and a half of continuous institution. Precisely because the family could no longer keep them, the other family's greatest work is still private, still theirs, still quietly compounding. That is the scoreboard. But before you draw the obvious conclusion, let me be fair, because there is one more factor at play, and if I hid it from you, I would be doing exactly what the cheap versions of this story do. It would be easy and dishonest to end this by declaring that one family was wise and the other was foolish. Real history is never that clean. And the people who sell you simple heroes and simple villains are usually selling you something else along with them. So here is the fact that complicates the story, and it deserves a fair hearing, because it is real. Blackmail. Tax timing, to be exact. When the Commodore died in 1877, there was no federal estate tax at all. None whatsoever. The modern estate tax did not even come into existence until 1916, and when it finally arrived, its top rate was a modest 10%. So the founding generation of Vanderbilts lived and spent in an era when the government took almost nothing as a fortune passed from one hand to the next. And much of the great Vanderbilt dissipation, the palaces on Fifth Avenue, the sprawling estates later sold off for pennies, unfolded across exactly those decades, largely before the tax collector became a serious force in the life of the American rich. They were never punished for failing to build a defense, because in their era, there was very little to defend against. Now look at the moment the Rockefellers built their trust armor. It was 1934, and in 1935, the government passed a law that lifted the top estate tax rate to 70% on the very largest fortunes, a policy the newspapers of the day nicknamed the Soak the Rich tax. So part of the Rockefeller advantage was not pure far-seeing genius. It was structure built at precisely the moment a punishing new tax regime made structure a matter of survival. The Vanderbilts of the 1870s simply never faced that pressure, and so they never developed the reflex. It is entirely possible that a Vanderbilt born into Rockefeller's tax era would have behaved very differently, would have lawyered up, locked things down, and built the very machinery his ancestors never dreamed they needed. But now notice carefully what this fact does and what it does not do. It explains part of the timing. It does not erase the core difference. Because the estate tax did not force the Rockefellers to create a family office back in 1882. That came more than 3 decades before the tax existed at all. The tax did not force them to train their cousins in stewardship. It did not force them to gather twice a year, or to build a family council, or to teach a child to keep a ledger over a 25-cent allowance. None of those things were tax strategies. They were choices about how a family organizes itself around its own money. Choices that were available to the Vanderbilts in every single era, and which the Vanderbilts simply did not make. The tax regime changed the stakes. It did not write the playbook. One family responded to the pressures of its time by building an institution and a culture that would have served it well in any century. The other, facing lighter pressure, built palaces, and when the pressure eventually rose, there was no structure left standing to meet it. This is the part worth getting exactly right, because it is where most people draw the wrong lesson. It is tempting to conclude that the Rockefellers were simply luckier in their timing, or that the whole story collapses into tax law and nothing more. But timing only rewards the family that is already built to use it. The tax pressure of the 1930s would have crushed an unstructured fortune just as easily as it sheltered a structured one, and plenty of great fortunes of that era were, in fact, crushed by it. What the Rockefellers had was not better weather. It was a ship built before the storm arrived. So here is the honest conclusion, with the nuance left fully in. The difference between a fortune that lasts 150 years and one that is spent in 50 was never a single villain, and it was never pure luck, and it was not simply the tax code either. It was the presence of a mechanism versus the absence of one. One family built an institution and handed down the discipline required to run it. The other handed down a great pile of money and hoped. And hope, it turns out, is not a structure. Which brings us, at last, to you. Because you are not here to memorize the history of two long-dead dynasties. You are here because somewhere underneath, you are asking the real question, the one that actually matters to you. What does any of this mean for what I am building? So let me turn it directly toward you now and hand you what genuinely transfers from their world into yours. First, build a structure, not just an income. Most people pour their entire lives into the question of how much comes in and spend almost no time at all on what holds it together after they are gone. The Vanderbilts had more income than nearly anyone alive on Earth. It did not save them, because income is not a structure. The moment your money grows past a single account and a good intention, it needs a design, a plan for how it is held, who holds it, and what it is never allowed to become. You do not need $1 billion to think this way. You need to start thinking this way long before you feel that you need to. Second, make a rule that outlives you. The single strongest thing the Rockefellers ever did was not a trust document. It was a culture, a set of principles about money that got taught deliberately, on purpose, to people who did not yet need to know them. So ask yourself a genuinely hard question. If your wealth passed to someone tomorrow, would they inherit only the money, or would they also inherit the discipline that made it in the first place? One of those two things lasts for generations. The other one gets spent inside of a single one. Third, treat status as a suspect, not a reward. Those palaces on Fifth Avenue felt, at the time, like the ultimate proof of success. They became the very thing that drained it away. So when you notice yourself reaching for something mainly so that it can be seen by others, pause and ask honestly whether you are buying an asset or a liability wearing the costume of one. The families that endure tend to spend quietly and build permanently, and they almost never confuse the two. The ones that fade do the opposite and call it living well. And fourth, keep your family a council, not a courtroom. Wealth tests relationships far more severely than the lack of it ever will. The difference between heirs who settle things in a room and heirs who settle them in front of a judge is not money. It is whether anyone ever bothered to build the room. So build the room. Have the awkward conversations early while they are merely uncomfortable, instead of later when they have hardened into something adversarial and permanent. And notice this about all four. Not one of them requires you to be rich first. A structure, a rule that outlives you, a suspicion of status, a family that talks before it litigates. None of it waits for a fortune to arrive. That is the whole secret, hiding in plain sight. The families that last build these things while the money is still small enough to be simple, so that the habits are already in place by the time the stakes turn serious. The Vanderbilts tried to add the discipline after the wealth. By then, it was far too late. The Rockefellers built the discipline first and let the wealth grow into it. Two families. The same century, the same country, the same laws. One built a machine and taught its children to run it. The other built monuments and hoped they would be enough. 150 years later, one name is still compounding, quietly, in private, and the other is something you visit on a guided tour behind a velvet rope. The difference was never the size of the fortune. It was the structure built to carry it, and the discipline handed down to hold it. If this gave you a new way to see wealth, subscribe and stay with this channel, because we are decoding the quiet rules of the people who build things that last, one story at a time. In the next one, we step inside the private institutions the old money world uses to keep outsiders out and insiders loyal. The rooms you cannot simply buy your way into. God bless you.